powinniśmy zacząć już 2 minuty temu kolejną, drugą sesję naszego sympozjum. To będzie sesja specjalna, sesja ekspercka. Naszą prelegentką będzie pani profesor Alison Milbank z University of Nottingham. Mam tutaj abstrakt. Pomyślałem sobie, że zamiast czytać, te abstrakty mamy przecież dostępne w internecie, powiem kilka słów od siebie. I will say few words from my heart. Kiedy byłem w zeszłym roku w wakacje w British Library, zbierałem materiały do mojej pracy doktorskiej, fotografowałem notatki, kserowałem i w pewnym momencie wpadła w moje ręce książka pani profesor The Fantasy of the Real, Chesterton and Tolkien as Theologians. Pomyślałem sobie wtedy, ja tę książkę muszę kupić. Nie będę jej kserował. When I took your book in the library, I thought that this book is worth to buy, to have it, not only to see few words or copy it. Pani profesor jest z światowej sławy ekspertem, jeśli chodzi o poruszaną problematykę. W tej książce mówiła właśnie o Chestertonie i Tolkienie, natomiast w tym referacie rozwinie kilka tez, które tam były w postaci zalążkowej w owej pozycji. Mianowicie chodzi tutaj o to, co jest wyrażone dosyć poetycko w temacie święty Tomasz z Akwinu pośród elfów, a więc o łączności, o zależności między tomizmem i między twórczością profesora Tolkiena. Są to zasadnicze idee, które teraz tutaj przedstawię. Po pierwsze, Tomasz pokazuje, używając określenia Chestertona, że istnieje to, co jest. I to jest centralny punkt koncepcji bytu, która ożywia także Silmarillion. Po drugie, da się zauważyć zmienność w tolkienowskim świecie. Rzeczy posiadają swój niezrealizowany potencjał. W napięciu między dobrocią bytu i jego przemijalnością kryje się właśnie ten magizm, ta siła przyciągania twórczości Tolkiena. To, co jest zawarte w drugiej części tematu pani profesor, mianowicie skąd się bierze ta moc twórczości oksfordzkiego profesora. Po trzecie, trzeci tomistyczny element, o którym będzie mówiła pani profesor, to jest tak zwany uczestniczący realizm tolkienowskiego świata. Świat jest zaczarowany, bo może być postrzegany jako oddzielny od obserwatora. I czwarty jest związany z wolnością. Pan Bóg stwarza ludzi jako wolnych i w takim razie w procesie wtórstwarzania ta wolność musi się pojawić w świecie wtórnym w postawie bohaterów. I to właśnie to będą zasadnicze punkty, o których będzie mówiła pani profesor, ale ja nie chcę teraz ukraść jej całego referatu, więc powitajmy panią profesor gromkimi brawami.
Dziękuję bardzo. Państwa zaproszeni. Forgive my first attempt ever at trying to speak Polish. I am very grateful for the invitation. It's wonderful to be in Lublin, a place so full of students and so full of experts in Tolkien studies. Well, departments of English literature, at least in Western Europe, have been slow to admit the artistic value of Tolkien's work, unable to account for its great popularity among readers, and attributing his success. Does this need to go down?
We have information from Portugal that it would be good to speak more loudly.
Right.
People who see us in internet, say that. So, don't be afraid.
Okay. Unable to account for its great popularity among readers and attributing his success to the escapism of his mode of fantasy. Ironically, he has now finally been admitted to the syllabus as an example of popular culture, following the Peter Jackson films, and can be analysed as part of cultural studies. That is not the approach I shall take today. I shall argue that Tolkien's literary effects are compelling, and they gain their power from tropes which embody and explore a particular metaphysics, a view of what undergirds and sustains our physical world, derived from that giant, in all senses, of medieval Christian philosophy, Thomas Aquinas. In the early 20th century, when Tolkien began writing, there was a huge revival of Thomas's work in different areas. Since Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris of 1879, which encouraged study of Thomas as a way of responding to scientific and other modes of contemporary knowledge, Aquinas had returned to the seminaries and to the pulpits. A lay French Catholic, Jacques Maritain, was influential in using Thomas to work out a contemporary aesthetics, and his book Art and Scholasticism would be highly influential on British Catholic intellectuals, such as the historian Christopher Dawson, British artists Eric Gill and David Jones, G.K. Chesterton, T.S. Eliot, and Tolkien himself. And of course, James Joyce works out his own Thomistic theory in Portrait of the Artist and Ulysses. Tolkien, a devout Catholic, owned a copy of the Summa Theologiae, and I have demonstrated also knew Chesterton's brief study of Thomas's philosophy. I do not, however, intend to spend time proving Thomistic aesthetics from the outside. I want to show you how it works from the inside of Tolkien's texts to give them their particular quality. That piercing, melancholy beauty, that depth. For the most common reason why people love the fiction of Tolkien is its inexhaustibility. You feel you could go on and never come to the end of his world. Unlike the computer game, where Slavoj Žižek once pointed out, the edge is quickly encountered and you live in the world of the dead end, not bag end. This is due, of course, to the immense amount of work lying behind the fictional Middle-earth, of which the collection of stories in the Silmarillion is only the tip of a very large iceberg. For the most part, it is dormant, implicit in the Lord of the Rings, emerging in small details, or as we saw earlier, in the lines of a song. This presence of a greater world, a longer history, gives to the novel what a literary critic would call its reality effect. It is not the same effect as in a realist novel, where the narrator of Jane Eyre begins her story, "There was no possibility of taking a walk that day." Jane Eyre here unites a world of bad weather in our reality out there and hers, and a whole series of social assumptions about when you can go for a walk outside the house. Tolkien may open his novel in a similar realist way, with the preparations for a birthday party, but he moves quickly, as we also saw earlier, into a more epic genre, in which the reality effect is made, not with our daily life of food and walks, but with a deeper truth, our human desire for the beyond. What reading Lord of the Rings evokes is a hunger for metaphysics itself, and for what philosophers call the transcendentals, truth, beauty, goodness. Even to speak such words in a modern British English department would be to evoke smiles or worse. For our literary criteria of value have become those of disillusion. We value texts as they uncover ideological fixities, structures of power, colonialism, essentialism. There was a point to the initial movement of deconstruction. It gave us tools to unmask propaganda, false assumptions of universality. A great work, however, will always question its own assumptions, enact its own unmaking. Through the ruins, you will see all the more clearly the truth and beauty that make such analysis possible. Tolkien does that very work. For the moment, however, I draw your attention to his effect of depth as opening the metaphysical. And paradoxically, this effect of depth comes from a strong realism. The plants, beasts, objects, and people of Tolkien's world have presence. An English poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, expresses what I mean when he writes, "Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying what I do is me, for that I came." You can see this in action in the end of Lord of the Rings, when Sam gets home. I quote, "And he went on, and there was yellow light, and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor in his lap. He drew a deep breath. 'Well, I'm back,' he said." This language is very simple, consisting mostly of words with one syllable. It uses the device of anaphora, the repetition of the first part of a sentence, which is an ancient technique going back to the Psalms and made much of in the early 17th century English translation of the Bible. It has the effect of birthing, creating each simple noun, light, fire, meal, chair, lap, Eleanor, as it does in the creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1 of the Bible. "And God said, 'Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together.' And God called the dry land earth. And God saw that it was good. And God said, 'Let the earth bring forth grass.' And it was so. And. Tolkien's use of anaphora similarly endows each object with intensity and newness, which is right for poor Sam, who has been away from such simple delights for most of the novel. Where all this is like Thomas Aquinas is its realism, its philosophical realism. In his book, Thomas Aquinas, Chesterton delineates the central pillar of Thomas's system as, "There is an is." He writes, "Long before a child knows that grass is grass, or self is self. He knows that something is something. That Tolkien shares this reality of being, and no subjectivist or idealist denial of a world beyond the self can be seen in the indexes at the end of the novel. He includes separate indexes for songs and verses, places, persons and beasts altogether, and monsters, and another for things. All participate in being, ends. Each plant or sword deals out that being indoors each one dwells, in Hopkins' words. For Thomas, to have an object, to have form, to be intelligible, to understand it, it has to have the qualities of integrity, proportion, and clarity, or radiance, claritas in Latin. When we apprehend these qualities, we're taken beyond the object to its source, because only by means of the source do we understand the truth and beauty of anything. We need ideas of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Maritain puts it beautifully when he writes, "Every form is a vestige or ray of the creative intelligence imprinted at the heart of created being." So to see something as having radiance is to discern within it a level of mystery. It conveys more than we can understand. In Maritain's words again, it has a secret. The technique of withholding full information about a character or a place in Tolkien encourages this sense of mysterious presence, what Maritain calls ontological splendor. A simple example is the tiny flower Eleanor that grows in Lothlorien, with small golden flowers shaped like stars. In her lament for the lost land of the Elves and the lost golden tree, Galadriel the Elf Queen sings, "In a fading crown I have twined the golden Eleanor." If you research this, you find in a letter Tolkien described the flower. It was like a pimpernel, growing sun-golden flowers and star-silver ones on the same plant, and sometimes the two combined. Here is the information we know to understand the Eleanor for Galadriel. It imitates the silver and gold of the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin, now destroyed and part of the lost Valinor, from which the elves are exiled. The clue was there in the fact that golden flowers were compared to silver stars. The more information you gain doesn't detract from the mysterious beauty. It merely becomes more heavy with beauty and meaning. The fact of its unknown depth already gives it ontological splendor. And the fact that Sam's first child is called Eleanor, after Frodo's suggestion, creates a relationality that adds to the flower's meaning as a link back to the undying lands. Chesterton's presentation of Thomas's philosophy moves from being to lack of full being, mutability. Things we see are largely in a state of change from one being to being another, or they move or they vanish. For Aquinas, this does not mean they do not have being, but what we see is not the fullness of being. We never see being as much as it can. Things change because they are not complete, but their reality can only be explained as part of something that is complete. It is God. Those are Chesterton's words. Tolkien's writing throughout his career is most clearly influenced by its Anglo-Saxon and Norse and finish, sources in its stress on change, death, and transience. Interestingly, the Jackson films left out completely the Hobbit's return to the Shire, where they find it in ruins, its trees cut down, its people enslaved, and Saruman's cheap rhetoric, the agent of destruction. Lord of the Rings is set historically within the mythic frame at the turning of a civilization, and there is a huge sense of loss and of meaning draining from the world with the departure of the elves. The last part of the novel takes the form of one after another departure or farewell as the characters leave Middle-earth. And the appendix describes the death of Aragorn and the appalling grief of Arwen, as well as the fact that a later king will undo much of Aragorn's good work. Those who accuse Tolkien of nostalgia misread all this material. In his letters, Tolkien wrote, "Mere change is not evil." And the Silmarillion describes the catastrophe that befalls the elves precisely because they would not accept change. They sought to keep the jewels, the Silmarils, as private art objects. Much of the power of Tolkien's writing comes from the tension between mortal humankind, which is oriented to the future and even a possible supernatural end, beyond the limits of Middle-earth, and the elves, who are immortal but fading and seek to stop decay. It is a tension also between despair, which leads Denethor to suicide and to kill his son, and hope, represented by Sam, who never loses trust that all will be well, even when Mordor is dissolving into dust and fire amid the destruction of Mordor. Chesterton's description of mutability and change in Aquinas does not end with a distinction between God's fullness and our lack of being and actuality. He writes, "If things deceive us, it is by being more real than they seem. As ends in themselves, they always deceive us. But as things tending to a greater end, they are even more real than we think them. If they seem to have a relative unreality, it is because they are potential, not actual. They are unfulfilled, like packets of seeds or boxes of fireworks. They have it in them to be more real than they are. And there is an upper world of what the schoolmen called fruition or fulfillment, in which all this becomes actuality, in which the trees burst into flower or the rockets into flame." Let us put this text next to a passage from Bilbo's birthday party. Here were rockets like a flight of birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke. Their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon the astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles or sailing ships or flying swans. Tolkien is clearly imitating this passage from Chesterton, and in Gandalf's fireworks, showing the potential of the world to be more actual, more real. Gandalf makes trees burst into flower and rockets into flame. And later, Galadriel will give Sam a little box of earth from her orchard, and when he comes to plant trees in the Shire, it will cause them to grow miraculously quickly. So we have here the bare bones of Thomas's theology, the reality of things, the changeability of things, and the diversity of things. Gandalf's fireworks open up another aspect of Thomas's thought. As ordinary fireworks, they go bang, they explode, they embody a kind of freedom, but these are not ordinary. Note how Tolkien's narrative employs anaphora again. There were, there were, there were. This is another occasion when the prose enacts a kind of birth, creation. Gandalf offers to Bilbo the story of his time with the dwarves in The Hobbit, when he was carried by eagles and stole treasure from a dragon. Later, the fireworks will enact all this. There'll be smoke, there'll be a mountain with flames coming out, and a dragon. So we see the lonely mountain, Smaug, and his exit when he flies out of his lair and is shot down by Bard the bowman. This is not just a memory from the past, but a liberation of objects from a story. It is an equivalent of Tolkien's description of writing fantasy in his important essay on fairy stories. He writes, "Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like cage birds. The gems turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you." Tolkien seems to bring together here Chesterton and his own writing about flowers and flames. The liberation that Tolkien believes the writer of fantasy offers is a letting free of words into new contexts of arresting strangeness. It is part of our human nature, which is to sub-create, to share in God's creative activity. We make still by the law in which we're made, as Tolkien put it in the poem he wrote to convince C.S. Lewis of the truth of myth. For Thomas, God creates not out of any need, but his own overflowing goodness, his ecstasy, by which he makes us and all things beautiful. He communicates being to us, and we are given that goodness as an ecstatic overflow, so we may give it to others and other things. Maritain and Tolkien then see this as a way to understand the religious dimension of making art and poetry. We make still by the law in which we are made. The goodness of being that God gives is a gift of freedom, which is why Tolkien emphasizes setting words or images free. It also informs the art within Lord of the Rings. The elves who made the Silmarils, the jewels, tried to keep them to themselves. Fëanor refused the Valinor the Silmarils when they needed them to undo the destruction of the two trees. Later, elven smiths fell prey to Sauron, who tricked their secret knowledge out of them, so he could forge the One Ring to control and enslave. Galadriel and the elves of Lothlorien offer a very different kind of making, which bears out this Thomistic understanding of creation. Celebborn answers Pippin's question about whether the cloaks the elves have given them are magic. And Celebborn says, leaf and branch, water and stone, they have the hue, the colour, and beauty of all these things under the twilight of Lorien that we love. For we put the thought of all that we love into all that we make. This is making out of ecstatic overflow of being and goodness. And it makes the cloaks have a particular quality, which goes beyond simple objects made through weaving. They change colour with their surroundings. They protect the person who wears them from notice. So the rope the elves make is not just the silkiest, strongest rope you can imagine, but has a mysterious silver light. It unties itself when Sam calls to it. In elvish art, objects are set free, so they have agency and cooperate. They share in the freedom of the divine making, as goodness is given them by the makers, who are in the divine image as makers who make freedom and liberate the material world. The things the elves make have all Thomas's qualities. They have proportion, integrity, and radiance, claritas. The light is literal, in they give off a kind of light. And Galadriel, of course, gives Frodo a little phial of light from Eärendil's star. It is a gift not just to guide their way, but to connect them to the world of the Vala and the light of the two trees, which the jewel, now set in the sky, conveys. It is representative of that metaphysical radiance which links things to their origin in Thomas. When Frodo remembers the phial in Shelob's lair, it grows in strength with his own hope, and he cries out, Aya Eärendil, Elenion and Kalima. This translates as, Hail Eärendil, brightest of stars, and is another kind of prayer, echoing an Anglo-Saxon poem, Christ, which had given Tolkien his first inkling of a world of paganism beyond the Christian story, which fed into it and enriched it. He read these words at Oxford when he was a student. Anglo-Saxon words, Eala Eärendil engle beolast, of a Mittengard monum sended, Hail Eärendil, brightest of angels over Middle-earth, sent unto men. Tolkien decided the name was that of a day star, and the beauty and strangeness of the lines opened up a longing for another world. And I argue that Tolkien's use of paganism is like a kind of pagan Old Testament, making the way for Christianity. The word strangeness here is indicative of the effects that Tolkien aims at. He wants the reader to imagine something mysterious and ancient and strange in the word Eärendil. One literary technique by which he achieves this is defamiliarization, ostranie in Russian. This literary trope was named by the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky in an essay of 1914, Art as Technique. Defamiliarization is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process is an aesthetic end in itself. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. Tolkien gives a good example in Dickens, which he reproduces from Chesterton. Dickens is on a walk and he sees a mysterious name over a door, Morifok. He thinks it's something mysterious and exotic. But once inside the room and looking back, he realized he'd been merely seeing the words coffee room backwards. Tolkien wants to go further than what he calls this Chestertonian fantasy, which makes you see the familiar coffee room freshly, to suggest something new. He writes this in the section of his essay about the second function of fantasy. The first function is escape, the second, recovery. He writes, recovery is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. This is Aquinas again, in the form of his philosophical realism. We inhabit a world of other entities, all of us participating, sharing in being. Knowledge in such a universe is, as Maritain puts it, reaching out to the object, towards the other as other, fertilized by being, rightly subjected to the real. This can be seen in Lord of the Rings in the way Tolkien imagines other beings, Ents, wild men, Balrogs, talking eagles, and above all, hobbits, who are so like small-town British people in their love of fish and chips, their tobacco pipes, and their gardens. The fusion of horizons between the Shire and Tolkien's modern British readers is, of course, then made problematic and strange by the fact that hobbits are only half our size and have very large feet covered in hair, which I assure you British people do not. Furthermore, the Shire is supremely unimportant in the world of its own day in comparison to the British Empire at the time Tolkien was writing. Now we are very small, but once we were big. Treebeard the Ent has no entry for hobbits in his list of living creatures, and to Eomer and the Rohirrim, they are as fairies are to us, a little people in old songs, though I believe in fairies. The preface to the first volume of Lord of the Rings has the tone of an anthropology textbook, in which hobbit life and customs are described with the careful scientific accuracy like Polynesian islanders, which gives the reader knowledge while at the same time distancing him or her from the characters as objects of scientific investigation. Making hobbits strange, defamiliarized, has a double effect. First, they're rendered fictional as a legend in their own context. Secondly, and oppositely, this very lack of fit for a group the readers become quite comfortable with renders them believable. Hence, the very legendary status of the Hobbit world engenders what narrative theorists call a reality effect. We believe in the Ents, dwarves, and so on, because we see them through Hobbit eyes. We believe in the Hobbits because they are our point of view, and partly because, after this has been established, questions of their existence are introduced by those same groups, which Hobbit eyes have made us see. It's a kind of hermeneutic circle. And this reality effect works both ways. First, to give integrity and context to the hobbits, but secondly, a sense of historicity to the world of Middle-earth as a whole. Tolkien wants us to see them as real, but not as our possession. He gives Frodo an end beyond Middle-earth. He sails off for healing to the Blessed Isles with the Elves, and he opens his eyes on the shores of another reality. Even our own surrogate Sam, who seemed at the beginning of my lecture to be so at home in the domestic hearth, is destined for the grey havens, according to Frodo. Even the geography of Middle-earth, which, remember, is our own world many years ago, is strange. It has different contours. And we need Tolkien's word in commentary to locate Gondor at Ravenna in Italy. What his novel does embody is an economy of gift and relation in a world stripped back to a conflict between good and evil, but one in which goodness is weak and evil powerful. Only by the gift of the self, following a Christ-like path before his birth as a kind of type, is evil overcome. And even here, Frodo fails, too wounded by carrying the ring to give it away. Evil triumphs, but destroys itself through Gollum's bite and the joyful dance that topples him into the abyss. Just as Frodo is saved by the gift of Galadriel at Shelob's lair, so he's saved by the eagles on Mount Doom as return for Gandalf's friendship with them. To receive a gift, whether one like the lock of Galadriel's hair given to Gimli, or the gift of trust and friendship, it's necessary to pass it on. To free the gift, the logic of freedom carries on. The gift gives, according to Marcel Mauss. A gift involves one in giving back and a chain of exchanges. Tolkien is fascinated by gift-giving and makes it central to Hobbit culture, in which you give rather than get presents on your birthday. He provides in Tom Bombadil a being in total accord with his environment, which he receives as a gift and does not own. He is master because the trees all belong to themselves. We see him bring a love gift to his wife and distributing the hoard of the Barrow-wights for everyone. Thomas, too, has an interest in the idea of the gift through the Holy Spirit, conceived as God's gift of himself. Tolkien even viewed his creation as itself a gift to be passed on and added to by other writers and artists, not his to hoard. Everything must be set free. The reader of this work is thus taken on a journey through the depth of reference to see the reality and beauty of being and its transience, its change, its mutability. We're encouraged to see the work of art as an act of creativity that imitates God in offering life and freedom, imaged in the art of the Elves. And we're encouraged to set that world free through gift, though the response of the reader lies beyond my remit today. However, we mourn the recent death of the great critic Umberto Eco, who began his career with a book on the aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas, and who encouraged us to discriminate the open and the closed text. The closed text presupposes a limited, defined reader and will not work with a different one. A female reader of a James Bond novel is Echo's example, who just can't activate the literary codes. An open text does not allow any old interpretation, but it's generous in bringing the reader into the act of interpretation and development. Tolkien does this by separating Sam and Frodo at the end of the novel in such a way as we feel grief about the fact that they are separated, and we seek to hold them together in our minds. Tolkien deliberately leaves Frodo on the verge of an unnamed destination. I quote, "It seemed to him that as in his dream in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise." This is a brilliant passage which yokes natural and cultural images to destabilize, unsettle our apprehension. Grey rain, nature, joined to curtain and glass, culture. Glass is impossibly rolled back. You can't roll glass. It might work for a curtain, but not for glass. The sunrise, as swift, quick, could go with actual weather, but here moves the visual to the temporal in a disturbing way. We're more inclined to think of people and beasts as swift, as quick. There is something strange in the repetition of an earlier dream and in the tentative "it seemed" rather than "it was." This effect, too, is theological. Tolkien has no need of gods and spirits or even Christ figures to make his work religious, because what his open ending and liminal entry to the Blessed Isle effects is that same opening, that same hunger, a desire and longing for something we cannot quite name, but which I and Thomas Aquinas would name as transcendence, God himself, the divine beauty which, in the words of Pseudo-Dionysius, calls all things to itself. Thank you. I think he's going to translate some stuff. I have a question. Oh, he's got a question.
Okay. But now I want to say that now is the time for the questions, you know. Thank you very much for this presentation, very interesting. For me, I forgot that we are usually investigating Tolkien about his philosophy or theology, but I thought during this lecture that Tolkien is a poetry. Those works are beautiful, and that's the point. I think we should start every speaking about every talking about Tolkien. So that's not the question, but only introduction to questions, and the first one is.
Yes. Professor Milbank, can I ask one question? Because I'm thinking about, you've been saying something about the project, the argument from the project, right, as well. It all comes up here of Saint Thomas Aquinas, right? And we know that Tolkien believed strongly in this argument, and that was the best argument for God's existence, right? For Tolkien, right? He's written something like that in his letters. But I'm thinking this argument from project, right? And I'm thinking about also the theory of Owen Barfield. Is there any connection with, with those words, philosophy, and some arguments from project like that? Thank you very much.
I better explain that Owen Barfield was a lay theologian and philosopher who was part of the Inklings group that met every week in the pub to discuss their work. He is not very well known today, but a very important thinker. He wrote several books. One book is called Saving the Appearances, which I think is the one that Michael is referring to, where he argues that in traditional societies, we lived in a symbolic world that spoke to us of God. But we have gone through the Enlightenment and through industrialization, so we are separated from the natural world. And for us, we have to take this alienation, if you like, into account. Is that what you were getting at when you spoke about Barfield?
Well, not only, because I was, thinking about Owen Barfield had this theory of the origins of language, right? And you mentioned as well, the words, how real they have, and the potential to self-actualize, right? And that was the case that I'm sorry.
I'm with you.
I wasn't that specific. Yeah.
I'm with you. I will say something about the first one, though, because that is very much goes along with Tolkien's. You can read Tolkien as purely conservative, but he is aware of distanciation and the need to recuperate this theologically. And I would argue that his idea of realism does that. But the self-actualization is very interesting because what Tolkien tends to do, he is a philologist, he studies words and their history. He's very interested in what you might call asterisk words, words where we've got gaps between ancient words and modern words. And he actually makes up words to fit those gaps. So in a sense, he is creating words. He is actually finding himself in language by making up or imagining bridges between old words and new words. And there is an ethics in his language too. The language of Mordor has no letter E in it, because that is, at least in English, is the most common vowel. And it's almost as if they are refusing the common speech, whereas the languages he invents are all languages which connect to older languages. So although there is this idea of self-actualization, it is always in a tradition. Just as the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argues, we cannot have virtues unless we have a tradition in which they can be thought. Is that more what you were?
Yeah, I believe so.
Ja mam taką prośbę, ktokolwiek będzie coś mówił do mikrofonu, właśnie żeby mówił to do mikrofonu, inaczej nie będzie nas słychać w sieci, bo jesteśmy w końcu na wizji. Jeżeli natomiast, bo prościej jest zawsze słuchać po angielsku niż mówić, jeżeli ktoś chciałby zadać pytanie, a nie był pewny swego języka, to bardzo proszę je zadać po polsku, a my tutaj postaramy się je przetłumaczyć. Bardzo proszę.
Okay. Very hard questions.
So if we're talking about arguments from design, right? Then I've heard Professor Peter Kraft, I believe, a US philosophist, right, saying that real things are found in proper names. that life is found in proper names. This is Saint Thomas of Aquinas' mode of thinking, right? I would say this goes accordingly to these lines. And I'm thinking how to, for example, explain this potential, right, in Tolkien. I know that he's been working on getting to the meaning of the words of ancient languages, right? But how to maybe tell more about the life of the words he's using, about the life, of the words, and how to express it maybe more simply. Yeah, can it be done?
Expressing the life of the words more simply.
Sorry for difficult questions. Yeah, I know.
I'm probably being stupid, but I don't quite understand what you're getting at. Are you trying to get back to an idea of the forms, or?
I'm implying that the secondary world in Tolkien's theory, he's saying that the alternative world may come through. Every myth can come true. Something like that. He's stating something like that in his essay, right? And this is the potentiality, right? And I'm just, just musing if this is what Peter Kreif meant, that in proper names we can find real things, that proper names give power, right? Yeah. Sorry for not being, yeah.
Yes, because we're not in a nominalist world. We're in a world where things connect you, and words can connect you to realities which lie beyond them, and so a secondary world. It's probably it's difficult with Tolkien to talk about a secondary world, even though he uses the word secondary world, because he wants to be very modest, saying that he is not creating from nothing. But words do connect you. That's what I was trying to get at with this idea of claritas. That they connect you beyond themselves. They lead you beyond themselves. To think about a chair, you have to have all sorts of other kinds of words, and including an idea of a chair, before you can actually think about a chair at all. And so every time you use the word chair, you've already created a whole world of meaning in order to understand that word chair. Does that make sense? You can't think of things on their own. They always exist both in relation to other objects, but also in relation to things further back, metaphysically, which make them possible. This is, of course, to think in the sort of terms of classical philosophy, and in particular in the terms of Platonism, which, of course, Thomas Aquinas shares as much of Plato as he does of Aristotle. But it means that when you say a word, you are actually bringing in a whole... You've actually brought in the whole of theology, really, that a word signifies. There is a British writer who particularly writes about this kind of thing, who is an artist and poet called David Jones, who has a little essay called Art and Sacrament, where he says, can we say when we use the word water that people in the modern world will understand the water of baptism? But so he is thinking about whether you can do this kind of thinking in a secular world. But I think for Tolkien, he makes his world very simple, there aren't a lot of things in the world of the rings. In fact, Frodo and the hobbits and then the Fellowship give up lots and lots of things in their ordinary life to enter into the quest. But this, in a sense, means that every object, every word has a kind of radiance, has a kind of birthing that brings with it a huge amount of meaning, which is what Tolkien meant when he said that we needed to recover a clear view of the world. He said, go and read a fairy story about silver apples and golden pears, so that you will come back and you will see an ordinary apple as having a realism that it didn't have before. Because only through myth, only through the transcendent world, can we get the real. And my husband, who is a philosopher and theologian, would argue that without theology, you don't have a world at all. You just have flux. Sorry, these are very deep.
All right, as a literary scholar, I would like to thank you, first of all, for drawing our attention back towards words, because I think we often forget when we interpret Tolkien's works, we tend to forget that we are dealing with an artistic text, first of all. But my question is different. Now, in this total vision, in this, if we assume that it is an open text in the sense of echo, is there any room for unorthodox meanings? Is there any room for something, an element which would, in a way, maybe not really destroy, but at least question this total harmony? Or would you say that it's a totally positive, totally consistent vision? How would you interpret this?
That's a very good question, because it is obviously read by Ronald Hutton in Britain, is a pagan writer who actually represents both historical study of paganism and pagan practice, modern pagan practice. And he would read Tolkien's text as a pagan text. It's very difficult for me, because I read it and have read it for so long through this kind of realist lens, to recapture the pagan Tolkien. I suppose you can have a pagan reading precisely because Tolkien is very influenced by Chesterton, and Chesterton believes that paganism is something that Christianity has room for, that it's a generous, open to anything positive. Where there is, I suppose I would say, a critique of paganism, is that if paganism is a worship of nature, nature has its own project, which isn't the human project. So that you can see the Ents, for example, who make their own decision about what they're going to do, and they do it. And it's actually quite helpful, because it gets rid of Saruman's workshop, but it is their own project. And many people have read Tom Bombadil, for example, as a kind of pagan figure in a kind of natural world. And so that you can understand how people would see a pagan reading and it opening itself to that kind of reading. But I think the fact that it has this enormous philosophical realism of the goodness of being means that a purely immanentist pagan reading can only be a partial one. I suppose I feel that when I say that it's an open text, I'm saying something about you participating in the creation of meaning. So I think you can get certain readings out of it. What you can't get is what they do in the computer games. You can't get an orcs are good reading. Pagan, yes. Orcish, no. Though I know in Eastern Europe there are lots of orcs out there, sort of trying to claim the dark side.